Humanism is dead. Long live humanism. Today, as so often these days, we are mixing things up a little bit. In honor of humanism's emphasis on intellectual connection and democratic equality, instead of a sermon, we have a panel. Our two panelists are Reverend Anastassia, who needs no introduction, and Eric Mattingly, who is a member of our humanist small group. So I'm moderating. I think that's obvious at this point. And the first question I have is for both panelists. In what ways do you personally connect with humanism? How has it been present in your own pursuit of truth and ethical living? Okay. Shall I reread the question? In what ways do you personally connect with humanism? How has it been present in your own pursuit of truth and ethical living?
I guess I'll go first.
All right.
When I was in 9th grade, I was in an English class. We were reading Catcher in the Rye, and I don't remember exactly why this came up. It didn't seem totally like a non sequitur, but I was taking notes in English class, and my teacher said, does anyone here not believe in God? And so as I'm taking notes, I raise my hand, and I look up, and to my surprise, I was the only one with my hand raised. And actually, I had thought probably most of my class would have their hands raised. And she looked at me, and everyone kind of looked at me, and she said, "Why do you keep living?" I'm glad you find it funny. So for me, I was surprised by her question because the reason seemed so obvious to me, which is, here I was alive. I didn't merit this life. I did nothing to bring myself into being. And here I was, a human being, able to experience the wonders of this world, the glory of nature, the experience of love and heartache, the taste of a wonderful Big Mac in my mouth, to be able to know what it felt like to have my hair brushed. And for me, that sacredness of the human experience, and not only to experience but to understand, was so significant to me. And so I would just take a deep breath in and go, it's amazing I get to take a deep breath in and to release it out. And for me, I couldn't understand that that wouldn't be enough for anyone, because it seems so much more than I ever could have imagined or asked for and certainly earned. Later, in college, even as my theology or my personal belief system evolved and included a concept of a panentheistic or process God in my world, though I didn't have that language at that time, there was a time in college, it was right after September 11th, and that was seriously the most difficult and painful time in my life. I'm from New York City, and so when I woke up in college my senior year, and I turned on the news and I saw those buildings collapse, and I couldn't reach my dad. He had to get evacuated by boat because he lived so near theirs. And I saw this huge cloud of dust take over my city, and I thought about how all those people had lost their lives, but also how the city and the community that I loved and that formed me had then just really suffered a really painful blow. And at the same time, my mom, who had a mental illness, was living in the city, and she was trying to comprehend this, and she had a huge justice streak, and so she was going around in restaurants in New York this time saying, "We should forgive bin Laden, I understand bin Laden," and my brother was really scared for her and how people would respond, and they all responded with actually a great deal of restraint and tolerance and forgiveness for her. And at the same time, just to add layer upon layer, my childhood best friend talked to me about how she had just been date raped in her college, and I just couldn't anymore. There was no joy, there was only pain, and I knew intellectually that that pain would fade in time, and I couldn't imagine why it would, or how it could when we live in a world that has evil and violence, and we don't treat each other well at times. And I could understand in that moment why some people would want that pain to end and how they could take their life. And instead, I would sit there and I would breathe. I would breathe and I would remember that promise of my humanist faith, which was that my life was precious and unmerited and given to me as a gift. And that all the things that I got to experience with fullness and love and joy, sometimes I also got to experience with great deal of dis-ease and heartache and questioning. And so I held my life in that precious way. And I share this mostly because humanism and humanistic theology, humanists don't have a reputation for being pastoral. But at the time when I needed a grounding the most, it was there for me, and it held me to a shore that I needed. He should have gone first.
Okay, first, can everybody hear me? A little closer? Okay. I struggled with answering this particular question for a week or two because it's kind of it could be really diffuse and boring to answer for me, but then hearing Anastassia's story, I thought, oh, wait a minute, I got something that has a little bit of symmetry with that. So I think I'll tell a little bit of a story back when I was a senior in high school, and I grew up in a rural community in Kentucky, which is if anybody has grown up or spent a lot of time in rural communities anywhere, they're not as romantic and bucolic as we tend to think they are, and or like to believe they are. And I was, and other people more so than me, but I was at the bad end of a lot of sort of banal cruelty and stuff for a lot of years or whatever. But anyway, that's not important. But anyway, I sort of, and not just what I personally experienced, but what I saw a lot of other people experience was at the, I was firsthand witness to a lot of suffering, and some of it pretty serious actually, but it kind of gave me a sort of a morbid sensibility that I still possess to some degree these days. But anyway, when I was a senior in high school in an English class, I was, and it also bears mentioning that I was at best a reluctant student through high school, and so one day I'm just trying to get through my last year of high school so I could become a factory worker, which is a wonderful thing to be, or and I don't mean that ironically either, but or whatever it is I ended up doing, and so I'm sitting here and we're talking about poetry, right? And like I was like, okay, well, we'll try this. And so we started reading, it was something like Percy Shelley's Ozymandias or something. It was something by Percy Shelley. And so I sat down one night and I read the poem, and all of a sudden I just had this massive change in personal perspective, and it was almost like Paul on the road to Damascus, like in that moment, I just sort of saw the world and I saw my life and I saw these things I had experienced in a completely different way. And I mention this because Percy Shelley is actually one of, if not the most humanistic poets in the English language. He was explicitly a non-theist. He was very much focused on the potential of humanity to make life better and to bring in the millennium, the millennial perfect world or whatever. And so for whatever reason, I just began to read this in over about 4 months. I was reading him, and then almost immediately after that it was Wordsworth and Keats, and I was just reading, and I didn't understand a tenth of it, of course, but I loved it. I knew that there was something there that I loved, and it had something to do with human potential. And so I went to church, as almost everybody did, a Methodist church, and my mom took us, and they had this thing where once a year the youth in the church would perform the service, and they do that here too, I think. And so we were all supposed to do things that inspire us or whatever, and not even trying to be sarcastic or not at all, and not even trying to be argumentative or provocative. I decided I wanted to do a little thing about Percy Shelley, and I was talking about his grand, wonderful poem to the human spirit, Prometheus Unbound. I highly recommend it. Wherein the Titan from Greek mythology, Prometheus, is chained by Zeus to the rock, and his liver is eaten out by vultures, and then the liver grows back, and then the vulture comes back, and it just goes on and on and on. And then eventually, he frees himself he frees himself, but the reason he was put there was because he stole fire from the gods and gave it to man, right? And I was like talking about this, and I was like talking about how much it inspired me, and how much I loved it and stuff. And I looked out at the at the congregation, and everybody was just like, I was being stared at, like, and it was like people were like looking at me agog, and I was, and I didn't realize that they were uncomfortable with this, and so I didn't mean to make them uncomfortable. But the point being, the central values of that poem particularly, and the idea that we have to take the fire, so to speak, for ourselves, and that we have to use it in order to provide light for ourselves. That has definitely been the main thing that has guided me ever since I've taken my faltering steps into adulthood. So that's
English class is dangerous. Theme of part 1.
This is good stuff. Okay, so the next question is for Anastassia. How did humanism come to find such a home in Unitarian Universalism?
200 years ago, I don't know if anyone would have predicted that this would happen. We were firmly in the Protestant Christian tradition. We had ministers leading the main pulpits, particularly in Boston and in New England, which was an epicenter of American culture and education. And so there are a couple of things along the way that prepared Unitarian Universalism to incorporate, embrace, and welcome humanism and humanists. And one of the first things that happened from our very beginning, when we were Puritans that came over, and those people were not even liberal Christians by any stretch of the imagination, but those are our roots. Couple things that were really interesting was that they were non-creedal. They didn't believe at that time that any specific teaching needed to be taught around the interpretation of the Bible, because they believed that the Holy Spirit would introduce accurate revelation to each generation and each church giver. So they didn't feel like they needed to standardize their religious lessons. The second thing that happened was that they were non-hierarchical. They also believed that no greater authority should tell an individual congregation what it should think or it should espouse. These two freedoms built into our DNA from the earliest times on these shores, the freedom for individual revelation and belief and the individual freedom of the congregation, allowed for innovation to happen. We basically started planting, sort of like how our different states innovate, and sometimes state policy then makes it up to national policy. We basically had a whole bunch of congregations that were allowed to innovate. And slowly over the decades, you begin to see more evolution, more innovation in our theology and in our practice of church. Once we became Unitarians, the ball in that process really began rolling. And you see in the 19th century a series of different controversies over theology, and Unitarianism expanding each time its theological umbrella to include more and more people of differing beliefs. So first we included people who, like Emerson, who believed that there could be a mystical experience, that you could find God beyond, outside the church and in nature and in other world religions. And then an even bigger controversy came with the formation of the Free Religious Association, that really believed that religion had to be rescued from Christianity, and that in particular rescued from any supernaturalism. And it was, in its heart, a very humanist movement and a very kind of anti-establishment movement. That controversy almost split Unitarianism. It was a significant schism that took a number of years to reconcile and to bring people back into community and to reconciliation with each other. And so by the time that was resolved and humanism arose within our congregations and from our congregations, Unitarianism had learned to truly widen the umbrella, to emphasize tolerance and inclusion and a diversity of beliefs, and not to be dogmatic in holding any theological line. I also think one of the interesting things that happened was that many of the people who were who were Unitarians and raised Unitarians, who were fourth or fifth or sixth generation Unitarians, they often kept their theological perspective, but they were tolerant and welcoming to other theological perspectives, including humanism. And then you begin to see a shifting, I believe, in that many people who came to our churches were humanist already and seeking a place in which they were allowed and free to be humanism and explore that trend. And so you begin to see it from being a family faith to a destination faith, a welcoming faith, a refuge faith. So, so that's another part and part. And then the final thing that I'll say is that many of the seeds of humanism, the things that it espouses, Unitarianism had emphasized already for 100 years, primarily the use of reason and common sense in reading the Bible, instead of reading the Bible through the lens of traditional interpretation. And so that reason-focused approach and the emphasis on human goodness and the ability for humanity to contribute to the good works and the process of character formation are all very humanistic approaches that had been held within Unitarian Christianity, but certainly laid the groundwork for a Unitarian humanism.
Thank you. Eric, how has American humanism changed over the course of the 20th century?
It's an interesting question, and it's kind of even surprising to me that I in college even read about this stuff, to be honest. But I guess the first place to start is that humanism has always sort of saw itself in some sense as a religion, which means it distinguishes itself not just from sort of supernatural systems that we ordinarily associate with the religion, but also with the kind of thoroughgoing atheist anti-religion that we now associate with, like Christopher Hitchens or whatnot. And I think that's an important place to start, because that has remained constant throughout the life of 20th century, at least secular humanism. And so I guess maybe the first thing is that, well, then what do they mean, by religion? And this is kind of semantics, but if we think about the Latin root of the word religion, it's religio, which essentially is like a little strap that they would use to tie together sticks or something like that. It binds things, right? And so if we can think about religion as something that binds together communities and binds together our own lives in a way that we're living with a common purpose, then that's kind of the goal that humanism shares with, say, the broader Unitarian Universalist tradition and Christianity and all these other things. So that being said, the initial like say with the initial, the Humanist Manifesto 1, which came out, and I'm going to mess up the dates, but it's like 1920 something or other. It was signed by all these prominent intellectuals, the most prominent being probably John Dewey, the philosopher and educational theorist. And the idea was explicitly religious in this sense of a naturalized religion, that you could take the human experience of life as it is and the use of reason and scientific method and democracy, and that you can sort of use those things to bind together a community and to give yourself a meaningful life. And they were willing to some extent, appropriate religious language. And John Dewey talks about the notion of God, a sort of a naturalistic God, wherein it's sort of tied in with human potential, and we kind of make human potential a metaphor for, we make God a metaphor for human potential. And so these sorts of things, that was like the initial thing. By the time the second Humanist Manifesto came about, whenever it was, had kind of taken a more secular turn, and this is where the term secular humanism sort of began to kind of arise in the consciousness, and the idea being that that humanism in this sense doesn't need a congregation or anything like that, but that it still sort of provides a worldview or a life, like some way in order to order your life, but doesn't necessarily require the religious language and the religious constructs that that the initial humanists thought were important. But up to this point, and this was about mid-century, up to this point, aside from the like the respect for science and rationality and whatnot, I would say that the most important thing in American humanism was its identity with socialism, and particularly communism, Soviet-style communism. This was, of course, before or right around the time that we began to understand, the Stalin, the crimes of Stalin and the repressiveness of these nations. Before that, it was possible for intellectuals to delude themselves, because that's kind of what intellectuals do sometimes, is to delude themselves that their own idealistic notions of things were actually true. And, and when we began to hear about the gulags and the purges and all that stuff, and it became kind of a crisis within humanism. And I'm thinking particularly of the intellectual Corliss Lamont. He was a philosophy professor, I'd like to think, at Columbia or Princeton or something, and he wrote a few books about the subject, and he was a staunch pro-Stalinist. And when these things began to come out and began to make their way to the U.S., he more or less just said, it's not true, and that caused a lot of, and that and similar things caused humanism to lose some respect and lose some moral high ground. And so I like to think that that crisis, sort of like how we, how the humanist community began to approach this political issue, kind of changed the movement itself. And so since then, it's been a humbler movement, I think, and it's been more interested in, taking on important but not quite so utopian political projects like, separation of church and state, and, and keeping people from, like trying to spend public money on finding Bigfoot or something like that. But, so as in all these things, time humbles, and I think that's the change over the 20th century. So.
Thank you. A question for both of you. If you had to offer a critique of humanism, something that humanists could do to get it right, what would that be?
Well, in keeping with the what I was talking about, being humbled, I would caution humanism to be even more humble than even it is now. I think the danger is in this sense of trying to be a religion, that a humanist or a humanist have a danger of falling into this notion that that we've arrived at a final answer, right? You know, because in, say, Christianity or even like Buddhism or more liberal religions, not that Buddhism is necessarily liberal, but just speaking in general terms, there's this idea that, like, well, you might have to do a lot of work or you might have to be really patient, but it's all really figured out in the end, right? You know, Jesus defeated Satan on the cross, and the war is already over. We've just got to more or less hang around until we get to reap the benefits from it. And so I think that there is this sense among humanists to be able to say, well, gosh darn it, we know that reason gives us meaning, and we don't need to fight for, we don't need to do that. And we all know the correct political answers to every single question. I think there's this tendency for us to, for me certainly, to get really too comfortable with that stuff, and then it allows us to forget about, the violence and cruelty and the irrational things that are just as much about being human as reason and dignity and all of that. And so I guess my critique would be to not allow ourselves to get comfortable.
And I would affirm that John Dietrich, who is one of the Unitarian ministers who helped really draft the original Humanist Manifesto, said we're basically replacing divinity with humanity. And to me, emphasizing our humanness as a meaning-making process, our human experience, our human capability to go forward and do good works makes sense. And yet glorifying and putting blinders on us to the fact that we don't always do good things. And there are people, and maybe we're all born with the spark of divine within us, but some of us do actions that diminish or hide that spark from themselves and from others, is something we really need to be accountable for and be honest about as humanists. That I think that's really something careful to watch, and so we should always approach it with all our work and all our thinking and talking about humanity with a great sense of humility, believing that just as we're capable of good, we're also capable of evil. The thing that also I see happening a little bit, I've been trolling the blogs and the postings of the American Humanist Association. It's really interesting reading. What I see a little bit that's happening is that there is a tensive dialogue within humanism, or I hope that there's a tensive dialogue within humanism, as there is within Christianity. So Christian churches and different denominations like to say, we've got it right, or we're concerned that you're doing this. I think that should also be taking place in humanism. And the real thing is that there is this shifting away from a belief. Since 2000, 2002, there has been a rise of what we could call the new atheists. That's what they call it, new atheists. And Dawkins and Hitchens belong to this, and they are I'm sad to say, the most prominent humanists out there. And those humanists, I think they don't really represent fully or always well the humanism that is most meaningful out there. They're particularly interested in countering and criticizing and exposing by rational argument where religious life and wherever religious influence is found. To me, that stance counters Unitarian Universalism's strong inherent value of tolerance. It also, for me, fails to recognize that most people still believe in God and have a religious orientation, and that religious expression is part of human expression. And so I don't feel that they bring those fully into account, and I think if they're going to be the most prominent names out there, then they need to be accountable to their own community. The number one thing that the American Humanist Association wants is community, to be in community together, to be in a community that binds us together. And in most places, that's still religious life. In fact, if you participate in religious life, you're more likely to participate in other parts of civic life. And so I'm concerned that this orientation against religion is an orientation against that which binds us to one another. And I think our community is the most sacred thing that we're given.
Well, a final question for you both. What about humanism do you affirm the most? Eric?
We'll go back to Prometheus and Shelley. The sense of adventure and the sense of, I don't know, there's a sense of power in taking responsibility for your own salvation, to use a theological term. And I would also my personal hero, my two personal heroes, the philosopher Spinoza and Emerson, they this idea of self-reliance, right, and not just in a shallow sense, but in this really profound sense of taking responsibility for yourself and taking responsibility for the life that you live without reliance on anything external to yourself. That's what for me keeps it as a living notion for me. So.
And for me, I would say it just brings us back to gratitude for all that we experience in life, for our ability to feel and to connect as human beings to each other and to this earth and to this time, and to recognize and uplift that though we are perhaps only human and imperfectly human, there's still a great deal that we can do as humans. And I think that message of empowerment and mattering gets lost sometimes, and if humanism can bring that back and remind us of that, then that's a true gift to one and all.
Thank you.
Yeah.